So, welcome everyone once again to this time when I'm going to be talking for about 20 minutes about what I do in Cardiff, exploring community ministry. Um, the work that I do, which is part of the ministry and kind of sponsored by the Ministry of Cardiff Unitarians, is a community ministry that's really about reaching out to those beyond traditional church. So I caught a couple of words, different words I use sometimes for this work, which is sometimes I say pioneer ministry or pioneer minister. That's a kind of churchy word, if you like. It's a word that's sort of developed, certainly within the Church of England for the past 20 years, and other Methodist URC, other denominations using that kind of word. I'll use that word sometimes, and sometimes but usually if I'm talking to people outside churchy spaces, I you more likely to use community minister. I'm a community minister, I will say to people, because that seems a bit more that it communicates something about what I'm doing without being jargony about these things. But the kind of starting point for pioneer ministry or community ministry is really this sense of that I'm starting with people outside of the church. There's many forms of ministry in all kinds of ways that engage with the world in all kinds of different ways, and many of our communities and ministers and congregations engage in multiple ways with the outside world. But this is a particular model of doing that. Not the only model, not the only model we should use, or not the best model, but a model of doing that that really starts where people are and really starts with those outside of the community and works from that point. Often I talk about the work that I do as being about seeking or promoting spirituality, seeking community, and seeking justice and activism, and sort of working out where those things overlap. I sort of think of these as kind of Venn diagrams of circles of justice happens as spirituality happens, and maybe there's some places where those two things overlap and what happens in those spaces. And kind of exploring that is a lot of what I do. But I think a good starting point is context. uh, because there's something about this which is about being very specific, specific to where I am particularly. This kind of starting point is the starting of where I am planted on this earth, which is here. On, you can see my house from there. I can wave from out my window from that picture. Um, so this is Cardiff, and this is particularly Riverside, which is obviously beside the river. Um, on the other side of the river is Cardiff city centre, with the stadium here, which is often, if you've been to Cardiff, it's a good chance that might have been the reason you came was to visit the stadium for rugby or for Beyonce or for whatever. Um, and really, where I live is this kind of residential area, which is really close to the city centre. As the river divides, goes straight from there into this residential area, which is kind of terraced houses. Um, it is kind of further on the other side. Sometimes this counts as Riverside, depending on who you're talking to. Is Pontcanna, but Pontcanna's a lot more posh. This is Riverside, or it's South Riverside, sometimes it's called. Um, I think the statistics one I saw was it's the highest area of child poverty in Wales. It's also a very diverse neighbourhood. The primary school, which is just in the point of this triangle here, I think there's 40 different languages spoken by pupils at that primary school. Um, so that's kind of Riverside and kind of mainly is residential, but kind of Canton, which is more over this side, is where there's more shops. It's a bit more like a little town centre, shops, restaurants, stuff going on. And so I sort of talk myself being in Canton, stroke Riverside. And this is just a very what it looks like typical street in Riverside, terrace houses. It mainly kind of looks like this. Not there's big parks quite nearby, but not a lot of green space, packed in quite tightly in Riverside. But it's a really interesting place, and it's a place where I've never lived anywhere where I've known so many people so close to me so soon. And that's partly because of the work I've done, but I think it is partly reflecting on the place in itself, in that I can walk a few streets and know 20 or 30 people from my house. And that feels quite unusual for me in an urban space. But it is the reality. So I came to Cardiff 7 years ago. Um, and we developed this sort of experimental form of ministry. Um, and it starts with being in a place, and it starts with, I guess, prayer and coffee is what I'm saying with this slide. It starts with a sense of prayer, of centering myself in a sense of what I think I'm doing and who I think I'm being and how I think I'm being. And I went to coffee shops. That's what I began to do. I went to a number of coffee shops. I went to a number of pubs, a number of bars. I kind of just hung out in different places and got a sense of the lay of the land in lots of different places just to kind of work out where am I? What is this place? And where are the places where connection happens? The other thing I did was then join in lots of other things going on, finding out through social media or through whatever what else is going on in Cardiff. And I went along to stuff. I went along to a lot of different things. Gentle Radicals community arts organization that I went along to some things and eventually got more and more involved as kind of a permanent volunteer and eventually a staff member. Kind of for Gentle Radical, that's got into a quiet period now, but that's been a big part of what's been really deeply rooted, because that is very rooted in Riverside. Extinction Rebellion and some of the climate activism is kind of what I've been involved in for a number of years, and really a lot of other things. I'm not necessarily going to go through everything in this list, but some things. I mean, some things. So, like the Canton Coffee Club was a meetup group that I went to start with, and then the leader stepped away, as happens on meetup.com, and they ask if anyone else wants to be the take on the facilitator kind of for it, which I did for a while, and just ran coffee meetups. And I'm going to come back to this as kind of a theme that it didn't really pick up as an activity. I tried coffee meet Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, weekday evenings, never quite happened. So that was just one thing I sort of tried. It didn't quite work. So eventually I sort of let that sort of uh, die a death. But lots of other things, philosophy meetup, I went to once or twice. Some of these things I only went to once or twice. Some of them became kind of a really regular thing that I go to. The Crafty Devil Bar is the bar that I've gone to where it feels like people most talk to each other. So I tried all the different pubs. That was the one where people chatted to each other. List picking groups, a lot of them I've been involved in. Some more before the pandemic, then kind of died a death a bit in the pandemic, and then have been since the pandemic, they're starting up again. Friends and Neighbours is a nice little kind of group for people who speak English and people who are learning English, kind of just to have in simple conversation. And a lot of activist kind of spaces and community kind of things. And again, some of the LGBT things that I went to. When I began, I thought maybe that's going to be part of the ministry, is going to be particularly within the LGBT community. Um, and I sort of did a few things with that. Then I thought, well, actually, that's not actually where the energy, what emerged from doing the work. So you think it's going to go into one direction, and then it doesn't necessarily. But really, over time, my sense of how this ministry has evolved, a sense of what it is, of what it's about, is really sort of you have to start narrowing things down. Things you can't sort of reach out to everyone and be all things to all people. You have to be start saying, okay, what is the narrowing down of the work? Um, and there's sort of two narrowing downs that I do. One is locally, like hyper locally. That's particularly again through the philosophy of gentle radical that I was involved in as well. So loving the neighborhood, just loving the few streets around me. not a big area, a few streets. And the other is spiritual activism and where activism and spirituality meet. So those are the two things that I do basically. Um, so these are just a few sort of illustrations of different events and things that I'm part of or I've just attended. Um, this is Chapter Arts Centre, where it's a community arts centre, cinema, theatre space, etc. And this big bar where generally I am in the day. I was there today. That's generally my workspace. I looked at that and I thought that might be me. It's not actually sitting there. I almost zoomed in and thought that could be me, but I don't think it is actually. That's just a photo I found online. Um, it's where the artistic community in Cardiff often are, and and the local community in Canton. So I find I sit there, I work at my laptop, and I see people almost every time when I'm there, and just say hello to people. Again, litter picking groups, things I do at the weekend, the pub, the bar, and where people quite chatty to each other, which is kind of very locally brewed craft beer that's brewed like at the end of my street. It's a very locally brewed local brewer, and that's their sort of bar. And various these are community events and gentle radical events that I've been to. My cat is wanting to interrupt at this point, so if you hear a mewing, that's the cat joining in as well. So the other side of it is dialogues around spirituality and justice. One of the things that that was originally kind of supposed to be a time of being together in 2020 that became a time of being together online in the first lockdown was kind of an interfaith, decolonizing faith dialogue that we had, that I had with folks who are Jewish and Buddhist and Rastafarian or Orishan, where there was, well, we had a kind of a dialogue. Intentionally with one another. These artists and kind of faith practitioners as well, mainly. Yeah, it's again something that I didn't plan is being in the artistic community, but that's just what happened because that's not my background or way of being at all. Other things that I've done, a radical Christian book group that we ran for a few years, often with books around spirituality, around faith, around justice. And things that have emerged in the last few years. One has been the Climate Cafe. Uh, a climate cafe is based on the model of a death cafe. In the death cafes are spaces where it is okay to talk about death, and might be a taboo subject in certain places. So this is a safe space to do that. On that model, climate cafes are spaces to talk about feelings related to the climate crisis. Not about action, but just about how we're feeling, how we're doing in relation to the heaviness of the world in lots of ways, and the heaviness of the realization of the dangerous political, climate, economic world that we live in. Um, and that feels particularly important to me because I feel like although perhaps factual climate denial has dissipated in this country, at least in the way it may have been around a decade or two ago. I think in many ways we're emotionally in denial about the climate crisis, and I think politicians are, and I think we all are some days. It depends on the day of not letting the um the heaviness, the fullness of what is going on in the world enter our hearts. And sometimes we need to be in a kind of a denial to get through the day. But there are moments when we want to create a safe space in which to allow that heaviness to have a place and for us to be operating out of not denial, but a compassionate acknowledgement of the reality that we're in and saying we're not whatever that means. And we're not offering any easy solutions to that, but we're not alone in facing that. So a cafe is a very kind of structured space where each person simply goes around in the circle and shares. There are different ways we do that with images and things, but that's a basic, very simple structure. That happens most of the time in Chapter Arts Centre, in the place I was talking about before. That happens to be the sort of best place we found. We might change that location in the future, we don't know. But there's a little kind of separate room where we meet and share in that sense. One of the things that evolved or has evolved, this is still just like very present tense, what this is. This was only a few weeks ago, really, that we did this. One of the things that evolved from Climate Cafe is a desire from some of us to then bring a conversation to spirituality. If climate cafes are spaces where we can emotionally kind of find a place for these things not to be in our feet for activism or protesting or our heads just thinking about things, but to be in our hearts, allowing sort of the realities of justice and the realities of injustice to sit in our hearts. There is, I think, for some of us a desire for it to go perhaps even deeper than that to whatever the language of that we want to use to our souls, to our deeper mystical hearts of allowing the sense of the reality of injustice in the world and our response to it and into how we're doing our spiritual practice and what we're doing with our spiritual practice. And so that's kind of the idea. It looks like a normal sort of terraced house, but it's a Buddhist center, this that we had this in. Um, this was kind of an interfaith and all faith and no faith or spiritual but not religious space for people to kind of get and share very simply, go around and share there were people of different faiths doing this, but also you say people who were spiritual but not religious, who are maybe exploring and wanting to deepen into having a spiritual practice. So people on different levels of how much they're committed to a spiritual practice, and so that's kind of a mixed group where we could explore some of these things in a gentle way. That's only happened once. We're sort of reviewing. Do we do another one? Does it exist in a different form? All of this is ongoing. And then some general stuff around spiritual activism that I've done over the years. This was before an Extinction Rebellion action where there was kind of an interfaith ritual gathering, sharing on a very beautiful summer's evening in the middle of Cardiff. That others and myself took part in and organised as the way of bringing kind of the spirit to the work of justice, to the work of activism. And one of the other regular things that I'm involved in and kind of coordinate under the umbrella of Christian climate action is Earth vigils, silent vigils that we hold outside of Barclays Bank. Barclays are the worst bank of the high street banks for funding into fossil fuel companies. Their dirtiest bank. There's some other dodgy things about them as well. So we're holding, in a sense, a protest outside Barclays Bank, handing out flyers, telling people about this. But more than that, again, doing it through silent prayer, that we sit there and we pray outside Barclays Bank. Because why? Because we want to bring the spirit. We want to bring a kind of sense of if this is the violence of the world, where we're trying to go to peaceful ends through peaceful means, as Martin Luther King said, to bring the spirit of peace into our bodies, into our hearts as a way in which we're responding to the violence of the world. And that feels important to me, to be holding that space spiritually, prayerfully, as much as not sort of responding violence with violence, but responding to violence with peace. And a few other bits and pieces, some protests. That was at the Cardiff Half Marathon, which goes past the end of my street, where it wasn't me, it was against a local activist that I knew that was kind of wanting to have this big banner up, and I was chatting to him afterwards and chatting to some of my neighbours. Um, there's Extinction Rebellion actions here. At last Pride, I went to the big queer picnic and just had a big sign up saying free blessings, kind of hung it around my neck and just wandered around and kind of gave people blessings. They asked for them. I waited for people to approach me and ask for blessings, and I just blessed lots of people in a kind of queer blessing on the street, in the field kind of ritual. And that was a kind of beautiful thing that was very, yeah, it was a beautiful thing. I was surprised how many people approached me and asked for blessings. It's quite amazing. And I guess spirituality underpins all of this. But the thing that the more explicit spiritual activities has been the thing is the thing that is most embryotic, is the thing that's least developed in a way. I do chanting and prayer online as a Zoom thing. This shows a picture of there was a summer solstice kind of prayer meditation gathering I had in the neighborhood once. But what hasn't yet developed in a regular in a regular way is kind of spiritual communities, people gathering together for um, spiritual practice, and that there are conversations I'm having with a few people about things like that. But that's the thing that feels smallest and most delicate and most embryotic um, today. So the point of saying things like this is never to say that you should be doing the same thing that I'm doing. For me, the point of a gathering like this is for because every context is different, is for other people to do different things in different places in different contexts, and for each of us to work contextually and within where we are planted on the earth. Um, so I don't say this stuff because I think people should copy what I'm doing. But I just wanted to kind of give some principles of what I'm doing that are more universal and applicable and useful, hopefully, for other people in other situations. So some of these principles, and this is fairly unsystematic that I've just, tossed out there, but listening, just being in that posture of listening more than speaking, of being in a place, especially like if you're, as I came totally new to Cardiff, I didn't really know it at all when I moved here. So to be in that posture, just listening to the community, of listening to what's around, more than coming in with your own big ideas. Slow. This is slow work, and it has to be. Um, this is a project that is kind of measured, definitely not in months. It's in years, if not in decades, if not sort of seven generations. That to me is a spiritual time scale to when you're looking at what are we doing, what are we trying to do, to think in terms of what's the impact of seven generations, which is kind of an indigenous American tradition to look in those terms. This stuff doesn't happen overnight. It's incredibly slow, and that's because it's about relationships. And there's no shortcutting human relationships. There's no getting to achieving human relationships because when you're doing that, you are starting to treat people as things, not people as people. Whatever you're trying to do, if you're trying to like recruit people or get people to buy your product kind of thing, then you're using people as things. Ministry, if it is ministry and not just sales, then it is about relationships, and relationships happen at the pace relationships happen. It's emergent, it's not planned. I didn't come in with, I didn't know I was going to do any of those things on day one that I've ended up doing. It's just been responding to what is and letting the spirit guide me in what seems natural and life-giving to emerge, not what I think my sort of plans are on day one. Narrowing down who you're engaging with, as I say, I'm narrowed down to the few streets around me and those interested in spiritual activism or open to the, around those conversations. Not every seed grows. As I say, there's been a few things I've tried and that have been okay, or they've been not okay, or they've worked for a while, or they've worked for a year, or worked for 2 years, and then they've not worked, and that's okay. Um, and being collaborative and interfaith. Um, God is everywhere. There's not a sense that I have the answers or that I have God. Um, one of the principles often talked about is find out what God is already doing and join in. Um, and that's definitely what I do. And it's become a more, again, I didn't necessarily plan this or think this would happen, but I keep ending up doing things in an interfaith way. It keeps being Buddhists often that are interested in doing this work and begin to do this work with me. Um, and so that's what happens. And I guess I'm interested if I'm getting theoretical or thinking about theoretical or theological or books that I might want to write, then I think, I mean, what does interfaith evangelism mean? What does it mean to be like, what is the way we transform the world together and invite people into spirituality, but not as um, rivals saying, come to my religion or my religion, but as collaborators saying, we're interested in working how spirit helps the transformation of the world. And just finally, I've just got an image which some who are at the annual meetings will be familiar with in some senses of fungus mushrooms and the mycelium, which many spiritual folks are talking about nowadays. But we think that like a mushroom is the thing that we see when in fact it's all of this stuff that's happening underneath the soil. It's the mycelium. It's the networking, the underground, the dark work that isn't very visible, that isn't seen. And that's really what this work is about, is the kind of 99% that's under the surface and not necessarily the visible stuff. So I'm going to end there. Thank you for listening.